With nothing but mounting debts and a condemned water pump, Jackson Miller makes one final desperate attempt to save 4 generations of farming legacy, digging deeper into the parched earth that had sustained his ancestors for over a century. What he doesn't realize is that 20 feet below his desperate pickaxe swings lies not water, but a hidden river of crude oil worth millions, and evidence of a century-old deception that could shake the foundations of Clearwater County's most powerful family. As petroleum engineer Olivia Ramirez helps authenticate his accidental discovery, Jackson finds himself caught between instant wealth and revealing a corrupt land grab that shaped the region's history, but might cost him the very farm he's fighting to save. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something truly extraordinary for you. The 6th month of drought had turned Broken Branch Farm into a landscape that resembled the surface of Mars more than the fertile valley it had once been. The irrigation canals that Jackson Miller's great-grandfather had dug by hand stood empty, their cracked beds a testament to the severity of the water shortage plaguing Clearwater County. Jackson stood at the edge of what should have been his best alfalfa field, boots sinking into soil that had once been rich and giving but now crumbled like ash beneath his weight. At 42, he had weathered challenging seasons before, but nothing like this. His weathered face had settled into permanent lines of worry. His powerful shoulders, built through decades of physical labor, now stooped with the weight of impending failure. "It's not looking good, Rusty," he said to the aging border collie. At his heels, the dog whined softly, pressing against his leg as they walked toward the ancient stone well that had been the farm's primary water source since 1887. The Miller family had survived the Dust Bowl, weathered the farm crisis of the 1980s, and adapted to changing markets for generations. But this drought, combined with 3 consecutive years of falling crop prices, had pushed Broken Branch Farm to the brink of collapse. Jackson lifted the wooden cover off the well and dropped a weighted line into its depths. The sound of the weight hitting bottom came much sooner than it should have. He pulled the line back up, noting the barely damp end with a grimace. "Damn near bone dry," he muttered. The county inspector's report had been delivered yesterday, condemning the well as depleted beyond recovery and recommending Jackson connect to the municipal water system, a $50,000 expense he couldn't begin to afford with the bank already threatening foreclosure. 200 acres of alfalfa and corn had withered under the relentless sun, reducing his projected income to barely 10% of normal. His last working tractor needed repairs he'd been putting off for months, and the property taxes were already 60 days overdue. Jackson squinted toward the modest 2-story farmhouse where 3 generations of Millers had been born and raised. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagging in one corner. His mother had planted hollyhocks along the front walk before cancer took her 4 years ago. They had died within weeks of the drought's onset, as if in sympathy with the failing farm. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Jackson turned to see a cloud of dust trailing behind a black pickup truck bearing the logo of Westland Agricultural Bank. Margaret Chen had been the regional loan officer for Westland for nearly 15 years. She knew every farmer in the county by name and could recite their crop rotations from memory. Her father had been an immigrant farm worker who eventually saved enough to buy his own small orchard, giving her a deeper understanding of agricultural struggles than most bankers. Today, her normally friendly expression was replaced with professional detachment as she approached. "Jackson," she greeted him with a nod. "I wish this was just a social call." "Final notice?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She handed him an envelope. 90 days, Jackson. That's all the extension I could get you. Corporate's breathing down my neck about non-performing loans in the region." He took the envelope without opening it. "Thanks for trying, Margaret. I know you went to bat for me." She glanced at the dry well, then back to him. "Have you considered Emerson's offer?" Jackson's jaw tightened. Carter Emerson III, heir to Clearwater Energy and the county's largest landowner, had been making increasingly aggressive offers to buy Broken Branch Farm for the past year. His latest offer was 3 times the property's market value, a premium that made Jackson suspicious of the man's motives. "I'm not selling to Emerson," he said flatly. "Not while I still have options." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Jackson, I understand the farm's been in your family for generations, but at some point, you have to face reality. Without water—" "I'll find water," he interrupted. "There's an underground stream on this property. My great-grandfather documented it in his journals. The well just isn't deep enough anymore." She sighed, clearly having heard similar desperate theories from other farmers facing foreclosure. "Just don't wait too long to consider alternatives. Emerson's offer won't stay on the table indefinitely." After Margaret left, Jackson stood motionless beside the well, the bank notice crumpled in his fist. Rusty pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. That evening, after reviewing the farm's finances and finding no path to solvency through conventional means, Jackson climbed to the attic of the farmhouse. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he made his way to an old sea chest tucked beneath the eaves. The chest had belonged to his great-grandfather, Abraham Miller, who had claimed this land in 1887 after working as a mining engineer in California. Family legend held that Abraham had used scientific methods unusual for farmers of that era to locate water when neighboring homesteaders had failed to find sustainable sources. Jackson lifted the heavy lid, revealing neatly stacked leather-bound journals, surveying tools, and geological specimens carefully labeled in faded handwriting. He hadn't examined these materials since inheriting the farm from his father 15 years ago, viewing them more as family heirlooms than practical resources. The earliest journal, dated 1887, detailed Abraham's methodical search for water. Maychak 15, 1887. "I have observed the morning mist patterns for 3 months and am convinced a significant underground water source runs beneath the eastern meadow. The old natives spoke of a river that runs beneath the earth here, carrying not just water but spirits of abundance. White settlers dismiss such tales, but I have found indigenous knowledge of land and water to be superior to our own in many respects." Jackson flipped forward, looking for specific details about the well's construction. June 28, 1887. "Struck water today at 32 feet. The flow is strong beyond my highest hopes. Curiously, there appears to be a dark substance occasionally mixing with the water. It has an unusual odor and separates when allowed to settle. I have collected samples, but am primarily grateful for the abundant water." The description caught Jackson's attention. A dark substance with an unusual odor. He continued reading. July 3, 1887. "Mason from town identified the dark substance as mineral oil, apparently of no value except perhaps as machinery lubricant. Advised me to dig a secondary access point if I wished to collect it separately. The water itself is pure and sweet when the oil is allowed to separate." July 12, 1887. "Judge Emerson visited today, expressing unusual interest in purchasing the eastern section of my claim. Offered twice the going rate. When I declined, suggesting the entire homestead was not for sale, his manner turned cold. Mentioned that water rights in the territory remain legally ambiguous, and that I would be wise to accept his generosity." Jackson sat back against a roof beam, his mind racing. Mineral oil, petroleum. His great-grandfather had encountered oil while digging the well, but had been primarily focused on water. And an Emerson had shown interest in the property even then. Could there still be oil beneath the property? And if so, did that explain Carter Emerson's unusually generous offers, a continuation of his ancestors' interest? The possibility gave Jackson a renewed sense of purpose. If he could find evidence of oil on his property, he might be able to secure a different kind of loan, or at least negotiate with Emerson from a position of knowledge rather than desperation. Next morning, Jackson began preparations to deepen the well. Without funds to hire a professional drilling team, he would have to rely on muscle power and determination, just as his great-grandfather had done. He gathered old mining tools from the barn, pickaxes, shovels, and a hand-operated winch system his grandfather had used for well maintenance decades ago. As the sun climbed higher, Jackson secured ropes around the well's edge and lowered himself into its cool depths. The stone walls were a testament to his great-grandfather's craftsmanship, each rock perfectly fitted against its neighbors without mortar, creating a structure that had lasted more than a century. At the bottom, barely 6 inches of muddy water remained where once a constant flow had bubbled up from below. Jackson set his lantern on a small ledge and began to dig, each strike of his pickaxe against the compacted earth echoing up the stone cylinder. He didn't notice the black SUV that had parked on the county road, its occupant observing his activities through high-powered binoculars, or the urgent phone call being made to Clearwater Energy's executive offices. For 3 days, Jackson worked, from dawn until dusk, stopping only when light failed completely. The well's depth increased foot by painstaking foot, the excavated soil hauled up in buckets and spread across his parched fields. Each evening, he would collapse into his grandfather's old armchair, muscles aching, hands blistered despite his work gloves, and read more from Abraham's journals for guidance. On the 4th day, as Jackson's pickaxe struck the compacted earth, at what he estimated to be 45 feet below the surface, something changed. The soil's consistency shifted from dry clay to a gritty, darker material. A few more strikes, and a small trickle of liquid seeped from the newly opened fissure. "Finally," Jackson muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Water would save the farm, give him time to negotiate with the bank. Maybe even let him tell Carter Emerson exactly where he could shove his lowball offer. He enlarged the opening, expecting the trickle to increase into the powerful flow Abraham had described in his journals. Instead, the liquid that emerged was dark, viscous, and carried a distinctive odor that made Jackson pause. What the hell? He dipped his fingers into the substance, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. Not water, thicker, slicker. He lifted his hand to his nose and inhaled. Oil, unmistakably petroleum. Jackson stared at the dark liquid now flowing more steadily from the opening he'd created. His mind raced through the implications, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until this moment. Abraham's journal entries about the dark substance, Carter Emerson's persistent interest in buying the property, the unusually generous offers. This wasn't about water rights or prime agricultural land. It was about what lay beneath. The flow increased as Jackson widened the opening, black gold seeping into the small puddle of remaining water at the bottom of the well. He needed to document this, needed proof before he approached anyone. Using his phone, he recorded video of the oil flow, narrating the date, time, and approximate depth of the discovery. "Rusty," he called up to the dog, who had remained a faithful sentinel at the well's edge. "We've got something better than water, boy." That evening, Jackson pored over Abraham's journals with new understanding, finding entries he'd previously skimmed. August 2nd, 1887. Judge Emerson returned today with a man he introduced as a geological expert. They asked pointed questions about water quality and soil composition. When I mentioned the mineral oil, their manner changed noticeably. The expert requested a sample, claiming scientific curiosity. I provided one. though their interest seems excessive for a substance they dismissed as worthless. August 15th, 1887. Disturbing visit from Sheriff Wilson today. Claims there have been complaints about potential water contamination from my well-affecting downstream properties, all owned by Emerson interests. Demanded I cease using the well pending investigation. When I requested documentation of these complaints, he became hostile. I have no choice but to comply temporarily, though I suspect underhanded tactics. Ididistum, September 3rd, 1887, received official notice that new territorial regulations prohibit private wells within 500 yards of public waterways. A category suddenly expanded to include the seasonal creek at the property's edge. The notice cites potential contamination concerns and is signed by Judge Emerson in his capacity as water commissioner. The timing and specificity of this regulation cannot be coincidence. September 30th, 1887, made a troubling discovery today. While in town for supplies, overheard conversation between Emerson and unknown businessmen discussing petroleum prospects and securing mineral rights in the county. When they noticed my presence, conversation ceased abruptly. I am now convinced. My discovery has greater significance than I realized. Jackson leaned back in his chair, pieces falling into place. His great-grandfather had unknowingly discovered oil, and the Emersons had attempted to force him off his land to claim it. When that failed, they'd used their political influence to restrict his water use, a pattern that seemed to be repeating itself over a century later. But why hadn't the Emersons simply claimed the oil through mineral rights laws? Jackson recalled something from a property law course he'd taken at the agricultural college. In this state, prior to 1905, surface rights and mineral rights were bundled together unless explicitly separated in the deed. If Abraham had maintained ownership through those early challenges, the mineral rights would still belong to the Miller family. Sleep eluded Jackson that night as he considered his options. By law, he should file a mineral rights claim, notify the State Geological Survey, and proceed through proper channels. But doing so would immediately alert the Emersons, who now controlled most of the regulatory bodies in the county. Given their family's apparent history with his land, he didn't trust the process to be fair. The next morning, Jackson made a decision. Before going public with his discovery, he needed expert confirmation and documentation that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried in bureaucracy. He needed someone knowledgeable about petroleum geology, but not connected to local interests. His search led him to Dr. Olivia Ramirez, an associate professor of petroleum engineering at the State University and independent consultant who's published papers frequently criticized environmental shortcuts taken by major energy companies, including Clearwater Energy. Her reputation for uncompromising scientific integrity made her the perfect ally for his situation. Jackson composed a careful email, including some of his video documentation, but withholding specific location details. He requested a confidential consultation, offering to pay her standard fee despite his financial situation. To his surprise, Dr. Ramirez responded within hours. "Mr. Miller, your discovery appears significant from the limited data provided. The viscosity and color suggest high-grade crude, and the formation description aligns with the West Ridge Basin deposit, previously thought to terminate 20 miles east of your general region. I'm intrigued professionally and happen to be in your state for a conference this week. I can make time for a site visit tomorrow if that suits, and please don't worry about the fee. This is scientifically interesting enough to warrant my time. Olivia Ramirez, Ph.D." When Dr. Ramirez arrived the following day, Jackson was struck by how different she was from his mental image of a petroleum engineer. He'd expected someone older, perhaps more corporate in appearance. Instead, Olivia Ramirez was in her mid-30s, dressed practically in hiking boots, cargo pants, and a worn university sweatshirt. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup that did nothing to hide a spray of freckles across her nose and cheeks. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, extending a hand that was strong and calloused from fieldwork. "Thank you for reaching out. Your discovery could be quite significant if it's what I suspect." "Just Jackson, please," he replied, shaking her hand. "And I appreciate your discretion. The situation is complicated." "In my experience, when oil is involved, it always is," she said with a knowing smile. "Show me what you found." Jackson led her to the well, explaining his great-grandfather's original discovery and the recent drought that had prompted his deeper excavation. As they walked, he noticed a tenseness in her posture when he mentioned Clearwater Energy and the Emerson family. "You're familiar with them?" he asked. Olivia's expression hardened slightly. "I've had professional disagreements with Clearwater. 3 years ago, I published research demonstrating that their extraction methods in the Thompson Valley were causing groundwater contamination. They attempted to discredit my findings rather than address the problems." She shrugged. "Standard industry tactics when profits are threatened by science." At the well, Jackson lowered a specialized camera Olivia had brought, allowing them to examine the oil seepage without descending. The feed displayed on her tablet, showing dark crude still flowing from the opening he'd created. "This is remarkable," she murmured, eyes fixed on the screen. "Based on the geological formation and flow characteristics, you're sitting on what appears to be an extension of the Westridge Basin, one of the richest oil deposits in the state." She glanced up at him. "Jackson, do you understand what this means financially?" He nodded slowly. "That's why I needed expert confirmation before going public. The Emersons have been trying to buy this land for years. Now I know why." Olivia manipulated the camera controls, examining the surrounding rock formation. "This isn't just a small pocket. The flow rate and pressure suggest a significant reservoir." She tapped some calculations into her tablet. "Even at conservative estimates, you're looking at millions of barrels, possibly tens of millions, depending on the deposit's extent." The figure was so large, it seemed abstract to Jackson, impossible to reconcile with his immediate reality of overdue bills and foreclosure notices. "What's the next step?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Steady. Legally, you should file a mineral extraction notice with the State Geological Survey," Olivia said. "That would protect your claim while proper assessment is conducted." She hesitated. "But given what you've told me about the Emersons and their local influence, that might alert them before you're prepared to deal with the pressure they'll apply." Jackson appreciated her understanding of the delicate situation. "What would you recommend?" "We need more data and documentation that can't be easily dismissed." Olivia tucked her tablet into her backpack. "I have equipment in my car that can help us analyze samples properly and gauge the deposit's potential extent without alerting anyone. With solid scientific evidence, you'll be in a stronger position to protect your interests." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Jackson noticed a familiar black pickup truck approaching on the county road. "Margaret Chen from the bank, making an unexpected visit." "We have company," he said quietly to Olivia. "The bank loan officer, not necessarily an Emerson ally, but definitely someone who would report unusual activity." Olivia nodded. "I'll follow your lead." Margaret parked beside Olivia's university-logoed SUV, her expression curious as she approached. "Jackson, I was in the area and thought I'd check in." Her gaze shifted to Olivia. "I didn't realize you had company." "Dr. Olivia Ramirez," Jackson introduced, deciding that partial truth was safest. "She's a water management specialist from the university, helping me assess options for the well situation." Olivia smoothly extended her hand. "Mr. Miller's case is particularly interesting from a groundwater conservation perspective. We're seeing similar issues across the state, with historical water sources failing during extended drought conditions." Margaret seemed to accept this explanation, though her eyes lingered on Olivia's vehicle. That's progressive thinking, Jackson. But I should remind you that the foreclosure timeline remains unchanged unless substantial payment is made. I understand, Jackson replied. I'm exploring all options. After Margaret left, Olivia raised an eyebrow. Water management specialist? Jackson shrugged. Not entirely a lie. We are dealing with fluid management issues. She laughed, the sound warming the space between them. Fair enough. But that visit wasn't coincidental. Someone's watching your property, Jackson. We need to work quickly. Unknown to either of them, Margaret Chen was already on the phone as she drove away, but not to Westland Agricultural Bank. Her call was to a private number used by Carter Emerson III. He has someone from the university with him, she reported. Claims she's a water specialist, but the vehicle has petroleum engineering department markings. You said to report anything unusual. On the other end of the line, Carter Emerson's voice remained calm despite the implications. You've done well, Margaret. Continue as we discussed. The foreclosure must proceed regardless of any developments. And my brother's debt, she asked, tension evident in her voice. Will be forgiven upon successful acquisition of the Miller property, Emerson confirmed. Your family's financial troubles will disappear, provided you continue to be useful. As he ended the call, Emerson turned to the elderly man seated across from him in the wood-paneled office of Clearwater Energy's headquarters. His father, Carter Emerson II. Miller may have discovered what's beneath his land, the younger Emerson reported. He's brought in outside expertise. The older man's face remained impassive, liver-spotted hands resting on an ornate walking cane. History repeats itself, he said quietly. My grandfather faced the same problem with Abraham Miller. The old man was stubborn, refused to sell despite the pressure we applied. Times have changed, his son assured him. We control the regulatory bodies now, the banking systems. Miller is already drowning in debt. One way or another, that land will finally become Emerson property. The elder Emerson nodded slowly. See that it does. That deposit has been rightfully ours for 3 generations. I won't go to my grave with it still in Miller hands. Back at Broken Branch Farm, as the sun began to set, Olivia and Jackson examined soil samples from different depths around the property, confirming that the oil deposit extended well beyond the immediate vicinity of the well. This is significant, Jackson, Olivia said, looking up from her portable analysis equipment. Based on these readings, you're sitting on what could be one of the largest undeveloped oil fields in the state. At current market prices, we're talking potential revenues in the hundreds of millions. Jackson stared at her, unable to fully process the figures. Just days ago, he'd been facing the loss of everything his family had built over generations. Now he was discussing wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined. What do I do with this information? He asked quietly. The Emersons clearly know something is here. They've been trying to get this land for over a century. Olivia considered the question carefully. You have several options, each with different implications. You could sell mineral rights while keeping the surface land, partner with a development company other than Clearwater Energy, or attempt to develop the resource yourself through loans against the proven reserves. She paused, studying his face. But first, I think we need to understand exactly what happened between your great-grandfather and the Emersons. There may be legal complications from previous agreements or claims that could affect your options today. Jackson nodded, thinking of the family journals in the attic. Abraham documented everything meticulously. If there were any legal maneuvers or threats, he would have recorded them. Then that's our next step, Olivia decided. Before we make any moves that can't be undone, we need the full historical picture. She glanced at her watch. It's getting late. I should head back to my hotel in town. You could stay here, Jackson offered, then immediately felt self-conscious. I mean, there's plenty of room. The farmhouse has 4 bedrooms. It would give us more time to go through Abraham's journals. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. That makes practical sense. Let me get my overnight bag from the car. As darkness settled over Broken Branch Farm, neither Jackson nor Olivia noticed the drone hovering at the edge of visual range, its high-resolution camera capturing their movements, or the 2 men in a Clearwater Energy security vehicle parked a half-mile down the county road, monitoring their activities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The attic of the Miller farmhouse had become an impromptu research center, with Abraham's journals arranged chronologically on a weathered oak table. Jackson had carried up from the dining room. Dusty banker's boxes containing family correspondence and legal documents from the past century formed precarious towers around them. Olivia sat cross-legged on an old quilt, hair pulled back in a messy bun, glasses perched on her nose as she carefully turned the brittle pages of Abraham's 1888 journal. Jackson sorted through a box of correspondence, scanning for any mention of the Emerson family or references to mineral rights. "Listen to this," Olivia said, excitement evident in her voice. March 4th, 1888, Judge Emerson's regulatory assault continues. New county ordinance prohibits agricultural use of land within 100 yards of oil seepage, citing public safety concerns. The ordinance affects only my property, as no other oil deposits are publicly known in the county. The intent is transparent, to render my most fertile acreage unusable, forcing me to sell. Jackson nodded grimly. It matches what I've found in these letters. The Emersons have used regulation as a weapon for generations. Here's one from the county assessor in 1889, suddenly revaluing Broken Branch Farm at triple its previous tax assessment, citing potential mineral resources despite no official claim being filed. They worked through the night, piecing together a historical narrative that spanned more than a century. The pattern was consistent. Each generation of Emersons had attempted to acquire the Miller property through increasingly sophisticated means, from outright intimidation in Abraham's time to complex financial and regulatory pressure in recent decades. As dawn light filtered through the dusty attic windows, Olivia carefully unfolded a yellowed document she'd found tucked into the binding of the 1893 journal. "Jackson," she said softly, "I think this is what we've been looking for." He moved to her side, their shoulders touching as they examined the document together, a survey map dated October 1892, showing the geological formations beneath Broken Branch Farm. Hand-drawn notations indicated not just the oil deposit Abraham had discovered, but its connection to a much larger underground reservoir extending beneath several adjacent properties. "This is an official state geological survey," Olivia said, her finger tracing the authentication seal. "Abraham must have commissioned it privately. Look at the notation here. Westridge Formation extends predominantly beneath Miller Homestead, with secondary extensions beneath Emerson Holdings to south and east." Jackson stared at the map, its implications sinking in. "So the main deposit is under my land, not theirs. They've been trying to get my property all these years because the most valuable part of the oil field is directly beneath Broken Branch Farm," Olivia finished. "The Emersons could drill on their own properties, but they'd only access the edges of the deposit. To tap the main reservoir efficiently, they need your land, but that doesn't explain why they didn't just buy the mineral rights separately," Jackson said, puzzled. "Even back then, that would have been simpler than trying to force Abraham off his land entirely." Olivia turned back to the 1893 journal, scanning the entries until she found what she was looking for. Here, April 17th, 1893. "Lawyer Simmons confirms my suspicions." Because I registered the original land claim as a mining engineer rather than standard homesteader. My deed includes explicit mineral rights that cannot be separated from surface ownership under territorial statutes. The only way for another party to claim what lies beneath is to own the land itself. This explains Emerson's persistent efforts to force me out. She looked up at Jackson, eyes bright with discovery. Your great-grandfather was clever. He used his mining background to secure a special type of land claim that bundled surface and mineral rights permanently. It was a common practice among former miners who understood the potential value beneath seemingly ordinary farmland. And that binding still holds today? Jackson asked. If it was registered properly, yes. Property law tends to honor original deed restrictions unless explicitly modified by subsequent owners. Olivia carefully set the journal aside. We need to check the current deed to your property. If Abraham's mineral rights binding is still intact, it would explain the Emersons' persistence in trying to buy the entire farm rather than just the drilling rights. Jackson retrieved the property documents from his father's old roll-top desk in the study. The deed, updated when he inherited the farm 15 years ago, contained an unusual clause highlighted by his father's attorney at the time. All mineral, petroleum, natural gas and subsurface rights permanently and irrevocably attached to surface ownership as per original territorial mining claim 873, dated June 12, 1887. This is why they've been so determined, Jackson said, the realization dawning. They need to own the land outright to access the oil. There's no legal way to separate the drilling rights from the farm itself. As they continued their research throughout the morning, a more troubling pattern emerged. Abraham's journals documented increasingly aggressive tactics by the Emersons as they realized the extent of the oil deposit and the legal obstacle to obtaining it. May 22nd, 1894. Attempt to burn barn last night. Sheriff refuses to investigate, claiming no evidence of foul play, despite clear boot prints leading from Emerson property. Have begun sleeping with rifle nearby. September 10th, 1894. Suspicious cattle illness caused by lame brain Emerson plan. Discovered contaminated salt lick placed at property boundary. Territorial inspector in Emerson's pocket claims no evidence. Have lost 12 head this month. December 3rd, 1894. Emerson men sabotaged well, destroying upper wall structure. Repairs will take weeks. Must haul water from creek meanwhile. Will not be driven off by these tactics. The journals detailed years of resistance, with Abraham ultimately prevailing through a combination of legal maneuvering, community alliance building, and sheer determination. By 1900, the Emersons had apparently shifted strategies, moving from direct pressure to more subtle long-term approaches, buying surrounding properties, controlling local water rights, and gradually establishing dominance over county politics and financial institutions. Abraham outmaneuvered them, Jackson said with pride as they reviewed the historical record, but they never gave up. They just changed tactics and waited for a vulnerable moment, like now, with the drought and my financial situation. History repeating itself, Olivia murmured, echoing the elder Emerson's words, though she couldn't know it. But with one critical difference. What's that? Abraham didn't know the true value of what he had. You do. She gestured to her scientific equipment, and the sample analysis results spread across the floor. We have precise data on the deposits, extent, quality, and market value, and we have something else Abraham didn't have. What? Digital evidence that can't be destroyed or suppressed? She held up a small device. I've been backing up everything we've found. The journals, the survey map, the deed restrictions, and my scientific analysis to secure cloud storage that the Emersons can't access or tamper with. Jackson felt a wave of gratitude toward this. woman who had arrived as a consultant but had thrown herself fully into uncovering the truth, matching his own determination with her scientific expertise. A noise from outside interrupted their conversation, the distinctive sound of vehicles on the gravel driveway. Jackson moved to the attic window, tension evident in his shoulders as he peered down at the visitors. 3 vehicles, he reported. Grimly, bank truck, county sheriff's car, and a Clearwater Energy SUV. Olivia quickly gathered the most crucial documents. They're moving faster than I expected. We need to secure this evidence before they come in. You think they would confiscate private property? Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer based on Abraham's experiences. I think a family that's waited over a century for this oil wouldn't hesitate to ensure inconvenient historical. Documents disappeared, Olivia replied, carefully placing the original survey map and key journal pages into her laptop case. Making digital backups is prudent, but keeping the originals safe is crucial too. The sound of a firm knock echoed through the house, followed by Rusty's warning barks. Jackson took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders in a gesture that reminded Olivia of the portrait of the next morning brought both clarity and complication. Jackson and Olivia had spent hours developing their community trust concept, identifying potential allies and anticipating Emerson's countermoves. Sleep had been brief, but productive, with each awakening with fresh insights about how to proceed. Over coffee at the kitchen table, worn smooth by generations of Miller family meals, they refined their strategy. Rusty lay at Jackson's feet, occasionally, lifting his head when the conversation grew particularly animated. The first step is legal protection, Olivia said, organizing her notes with the same precision she applied to scientific data. We need to file the mineral rights documentation with the State Geological Survey and establish the legal framework for the community trust before Emerson can challenge our claim. Jackson nodded. And we need financial breathing room. Even with the oil discovery, the bank can still proceed with foreclosure if I miss the 90-day deadline for repayment. I have a contact at First Regional Bank in the capital, Olivia offered. They're outside Clearwater Energy's immediate sphere of influence. With the documentation we've compiled and my preliminary assessment of the deposit's value, they might provide bridge financing. The plan was taking shape, but Jackson still felt uncertainty gnawing at him. Not about the course of action. He was increasingly convinced their community-focused approach was right, but about his own motives and responsibilities. My great-grandfather fought to keep this land in the family, he said, gazing out the window at fields his ancestors had tilled for generations. Am I betraying his legacy by essentially giving away control of the mineral rights to a community trust? Olivia considered his question carefully. I don't think Abraham was fighting just for ownership, she said finally. From his journals, it seems he was fighting against exploitation and corruption. He wanted fair treatment under the law, not special privilege. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture of support that felt surprisingly natural despite their brief acquaintance. The trust approach honors that fight by ensuring the resource benefits many rather than enriching a few through manipulation. I think he'd approve. Jackson turned his hand to grasp hers, drawing strength from her conviction. Then let's get to work. Their first call was to Rachel Blackfoot, an environmental attorney known for successfully challenging extractive industries on behalf of communities. Rachel had grown up in Clearwater County before leaving for law school, and she understood the local power dynamics intimately. A community mineral rights trust is ambitious, Rachel said after they'd explained their situation via video call, but legally sound if structured properly. The binding of surface and mineral rights in the original claim gives you solid standing, Jackson. What about Emerson's likely challenges? Olivia asked. Rachel's expression grew serious. They'll come, at you from every angle, claim defects in the original filing, argue adverse possession, challenge the scientific assessment, and probably dig up some obscure county regulation they control to obstruct you. But with proper documentation and public visibility, we can counter each move. And the timeline? Jackson asked, acutely aware of the foreclosure deadline. Fast-tracked with the right connections, Rachel assured him. I've worked with similar structures for tribal mineral rights. We can adapt those templates. If you're both free, I can drive out tomorrow to review the documentation in person and get the paperwork started. After ending the call, they reached out to Dr. Marcus Chen, Margaret's brother and a geology professor at the State University, whose gambling debts had made his sister vulnerable to Emerson's manipulation. Initially hesitant, Marcus agreed to meet them after Olivia assured him their goal was to free his sister from Emerson's control, not expose her compromised position. By mid-afternoon, they had scheduled meetings with a community development expert, a sustainable agriculture advisor, and the editor of the regional newspaper, who expressed interest in the historical aspects of the story. Progress was tangible, momentum building. Then Jackson's phone rang, a local number he didn't recognize. Mr. Miller. The voice was elderly, but strong. This is Carter Emerson II. My son may lack subtlety, but he's right about one thing. This matter has waited long enough for resolution. I'd like to meet with you privately. No lawyers, no assistants, just two men whose families have been connected for generations. Jackson covered the phone and explained the call to Olivia, who looked concerned but nodded her agreement. They needed to understand their opposition fully. All right, Jackson said into the phone. Where and when? The old covered bridge at Willow Creek, 1 hour. Come alone, as will I. The covered bridge dated back to the 1870s, one of the county's oldest structures. It spanned Willow Creek at a narrow point about 3 miles from Broken Branch Farm, rarely used since the construction of the modern highway bridge downstream in the 1960s. It could be a trap, Olivia warned as Jackson prepared to leave. Possibly, he conceded, but the elder Emerson has always maintained a veneer of respectability. A direct attack would damage the family's carefully cultivated public image. Nevertheless, he took precautions, sending Rachel Blackfoot his location details and asking her to contact the sheriff if he didn't check in within 2 hours. Olivia would continue their preparation work while monitoring his location via shared GPS. The bridge came into view as Jackson rounded the final bend in the old county road, a weathered wooden structure spanning the creek, its red-painted sides faded to a dull rust color, roof sagging slightly at the center. A black luxury sedan was parked at the far end, its driver standing beside it. Jackson parked his truck and approached on foot. Carter Emerson II awaited him at the bridge's center, leaning on an ornate cane, his thin frame silhouetted against the afternoon light filtering through gaps in the roof planks. Despite his 84 years, the elder Emerson stood straight, his white hair neatly combed, his clothes expensive but understated. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in Jackson's appearance with an unsettling thoroughness. You looked like him, Emerson said without preamble. Abraham. There's a photograph in my father's papers. Abraham Miller facing down the sheriff at the county line. Same jaw, same eyes. You knew him? Jackson asked, surprised. No, but my father did. He was 12 years old during their first confrontation. In 1887, it left an impression. Emerson gestured toward the creek below. He told me Abraham once physically threw a Clearwater surveyor off this very bridge for trespassing on his water rights. Despite himself, Jackson smiled slightly. The story aligned with Abraham's character as revealed in his journals. I didn't ask you here to reminisce, Emerson continued. I asked you here to make an offer my son is too proud to extend. Double the market value of your property, plus 10% of any oil revenues extracted over the next decade. You maintain naming rights to the operation. Miller Field has a suitable ring and receive public credit for the discovery. The offer was significantly more generous than anything previously proposed, acknowledging both the financial and historical value of Jackson's claim. It was, in conventional terms, a fair deal, perhaps even advantageous to Jackson personally. "Why now?" Jackson asked. "Why this sudden generosity after a century of pressure tactics?" Emerson's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps respect for the direct question. "I'm dying, Mr. Miller. Cancer. 6 months, perhaps less. I've lived my entire life with my father's resentment about that oil field. He instilled in me an obligation to secure what he believed was rightfully ours." He tapped his cane against the wooden planks. "I've accomplished everything else expected of me, expanded the family businesses, increased our political influence, secured our position. This one task remains unfulfilled. I would like to complete it before I die." The frank admission of mortality lent weight to his words. This wasn't a negotiating tactic, but a final attempt to fulfill a generational mission. "And if I decline?" Jackson asked. "Then the conflict continues as it has for over a century," Emerson replied matter-of-factly. "My son lacks my patience and historical perspective. He sees only the prize, not the process. He will pursue this with every resource at his disposal, and those resources are considerable." Jackson considered the old man standing before him, the culmination of generations of wealth, power, and entitlement, yet also simply a human being facing his mortality, seeking to fulfill what he saw as a familial obligation. "Your family has tried to take this land through manipulation, legal maneuvering, and economic pressure for over 100 years, Jackson said finally. "Did any of you ever consider that it might not rightfully be yours to take?" Emerson's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened slightly on the head of his cane. "Natural resources belong to those who can develop them properly. Your great-grandfather was a stubborn obstacle to progress. You're continuing that tradition, apparently." "No," Jackson corrected him. "I'm honoring a different tradition. Standing against powerful interests who believe their wealth entitles them to whatever they want, regardless of law or ethics." He stepped closer, close enough to see the network of age lines mapping the old man's face. Abraham didn't just protect his land, he protected a principle. The oil beneath Broken Branch Farm doesn't belong to the Emersons simply because you want it or believe you deserve it. And it doesn't belong solely to me either, despite my legal claim. "What are you suggesting?" Emerson asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his composed exterior. "That resources of this magnitude should benefit the community, not just enrich a single family or corporation. I'm establishing a trust that will ensure responsible extraction while directing the primary benefits to county infrastructure, education, and healthcare." For the first time in their conversation, Emerson appeared genuinely surprised. "A community trust? You'd give away millions to make a moral point?" "Not give away," Jackson clarified. "Redirect. The trust will ensure I maintain operational control of the farm itself while receiving fair compensation as the rights holder. But the bulk of the proceeds will serve the broader community rather than concentrating wealth that already exists in abundance within your family." Emerson studied him with newfound intensity. "You truly are Abraham's descendant," he said finally, "equally stubborn, equally idealistic. But the world doesn't reward idealism, Mr. Miller. It rewards power and strategic thinking." "Perhaps," Jackson acknowledged, "but it also occasionally recognizes justice, especially when people stand together against exploitation. The community trust approach will have broad support once people understand its benefits. Fighting against it would position Clearwater as an enemy of local prosperity, challenging the carefully constructed public image your family has built over generations." The strategic implications weren't lost on the elder Emerson. His family's power depended partly on the perception that their interests aligned with community welfare. Openly opposing a plan designed to direct resource wealth to public benefit would undermine decades of carefully cultivated political goodwill. "You've thought this through more thoroughly than I expected," Emerson admitted, "though implementation will be more difficult than you imagine." "The regulatory bodies that you control," Jackson interjected. "Yes, we're aware, but regulatory obstruction becomes more difficult under public scrutiny. The historical documentation we've uncovered, combined with the community benefit approach, creates a compelling narrative that even your media connections would struggle to counter." For several moments, Emerson was silent, weighing options and implications with the calculation that had built his family's empire. When he spoke again, his tone had changed subtly. "What role would you envision for Clearwater Energy in this community trust arrangement?" The question revealed a strategic mind adapting to new information, seeking advantage within the changed parameters rather than simply opposing them. Jackson had anticipated this potential pivot. "An operational partnership would be necessary," he acknowledged. "The trust needs an experienced extraction company, but as a partner with defined responsibilities and benefits, not as the controlling interest. Transparent operations, fair profit sharing, and environmental accountability would be non-negotiable conditions." Emerson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "An interesting proposal, not acceptable in its current form, but perhaps negotiable. I'll need to consider the implications." He turned to leave, then paused. "My son won't be as receptive to this approach. He lacks historical perspective and sees compromise as weakness. Be prepared for resistance." "I am," Jackson assured him, "just as Abraham was." As the elder Emerson walked away, his steps measured and deliberate despite his illness, Jackson felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The conversation had confirmed his chosen path while clarifying the challenges ahead. The Emersons might adapt their strategy, but their fundamental goal remained unchanged, controlling the oil beneath Broken Branch Farm. When Jackson returned to the farmhouse, he found Olivia in conversation with Marcus Chen, Margaret's brother. The geology professor looked haggard, the strain of his gambling addiction and subsequent entanglement with the Emersons evident in his hunched posture and nervous movements. "Jackson," Olivia greeted him with evident relief, "Marcus has been explaining some of the geological complexities of the deposit and the extent of Emerson's preparation to acquire your property." Marcus nodded, his academic demeanor at odds with his obvious anxiety. "They've been planning this for decades, buying surrounding properties strategically, installing monitoring wells disguised as agricultural irrigation, even conducting seismic surveys during road construction projects to map the deposit's boundaries, all while maintaining the pretense that they were simply interested in agricultural consolidation," Olivia added. "They've known exactly what's under your land since the 1980s, Marcus confirmed. Modern geological survey techniques removed any doubt about the deposit's extent and value. They've been waiting for the right moment, a vulnerable owner, a natural crisis like this drought, to make their final move. And they used your sister to monitor me through the bank," Jackson said, "not as accusation but as confirmation." Marcus looked down, ashamed. "My gambling debts made her vulnerable. Emerson bought the markers from my creditors, then used them to pressure Margaret. She had no choice. They threatened to have me fired from the university and criminally charged if she didn't cooperate." "We don't blame Margaret," Olivia assured him. "We're trying to help her escape their influence, just as we're trying to protect the oil deposit from their control." Marcus looked up, hope flickering across his tired features. "The community trust approach might actually work. Emerson's political influence depends on maintaining the appearance of community benefit. Directly opposing a plan that transparently serves public interest would damage their carefully constructed image. "That's what I told the elder Emerson at our meeting," Jackson said, proceeding to recount the conversation at the covered bridge. When he finished, Olivia looked thoughtful. His willingness to discuss partnership rather than simply reject the concept outright suggests they might adapt rather than directly oppose. That could be more dangerous in some ways. They could attempt to infiltrate the trust governance structure or manipulate the terms to gradually increase their control, which is why we need impeccable legal structuring and transparent governance, Jackson agreed. Rachel's expertise will be crucial there. As they continued strategizing into the evening, the moral dimensions of their approach became increasingly clear to Jackson. This wasn't just about protecting his inheritance or defeating the Emersons. It was about transforming a resource that had been a source of conflict for generations into a force for community benefit. Abraham had fought to protect what was rightfully his against powerful interests who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they desired. Jackson was fighting a similar battle, but with an expanded vision, not just protecting individual rights, but advancing collective welfare. The oil beneath Broken Branch Farm represented both tremendous opportunity and significant responsibility. How that resource was developed would shape not just Jackson's future, but the trajectory of the entire community for generations to come. The choice between personal enrichment and broader benefit reflected the kind of person he wanted to be and the legacy he hoped to leave. As darkness fell over the farmhouse, Jackson stood on the porch, looking out over land his family had tended. For over a century, the fields were still parched, the earth cracked from drought, but beneath that temporarily barren surface lay both the history of his family's perseverance and the potential for a different kind of future than either the Millers or the Emersons had envisioned. Olivia joined him, her presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. In the short time since her arrival, she had become not just an ally in the struggle against the Emersons, but a partner in imagining a more equitable approach to resource development, one that balanced individual rights with community benefit, economic prosperity with environmental responsibility. "Do you think we can actually pull this off?" he asked quietly, giving voice to the uncertainty that still lingered beneath his determination. "I think we have to try," she replied, her shoulder brushing against his as they stood side by side, looking out over the darkened fields. "Some fights are worth having regardless of the odds." In that moment, Jackson felt a connection not just to Abraham and the generations of millers who had worked this land, but to something larger, a tradition of standing firm against exploitation, of choosing principle over expedience, of imagining how things could be rather than simply accepting how they were. The path forward remained challenging and uncertain. The Emersons' power was real, their determination to control the oil deposit undiminished despite the elder Emersons' willingness to consider compromise. The legal, financial and political obstacles to establishing the community trust would require all their resources and ingenuity to overcome. But for the first time since the drought had begun to threaten everything he valued, Jackson felt a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. The oil discovered beneath the ancient well offered not just financial salvation, but an opportunity to honor his heritage while serving the broader community, to transform a resource that had been a source of conflict into a foundation for collective prosperity. As he and Olivia turned to re-enter the farmhouse, their shadows merging in the porch light, Jackson knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had found both the right cause and the right ally to face them. Together, they would write a new chapter in the long story of Broken Branch Farm, one that might finally resolve the century-old conflict between the Millers and the Emersons, not through surrender or defeat, but through a vision of shared benefit. that neither family had previously imagined. The following week unfolded with the intensity of a gathering storm. Rachel Blackfoot arrived with her legal team, converting Jackson's dining room into a makeshift war room filled with laptops, legal documents, and geological reports. Olivia's scientific colleagues conducted comprehensive testing that confirmed the oil deposit's extent and quality, worth billions rather than mere millions. News of the discovery and the proposed community trust had begun to spread through Clearwater County, creating precisely the public visibility they had hoped would provide some protection against Emerson's machinations. The regional newspaper ran a front-page story titled "Farmer's Ancient Well Yields Modern Treasure," featuring an interview with Jackson about his vision for community benefit. Public reaction was cautiously supportive, though tinged with skepticism, about whether such an idealistic approach could succeed against Clearwater Energy's entrenched power. Longtime residents remembered previous challenges to the Emerson family's interests that had mysteriously faltered or disappeared altogether. "We're getting traction, but we need more community engagement," Rachel advised during their morning strategy session. "The Emersons are already working to counter our narrative, suggesting the trust concept is impractical, that professional management is required for proper resource development." Marcus Chen, who had become an unexpected ally, nodded in agreement. "They're emphasizing job creation through Clearwater's established operations, while quietly suggesting your approach lacks expertise and infrastructure." "Then we need to make the benefits more concrete," Jackson decided. "Not just abstract promises of future community investment, but specific commitments that people can visualize and believe in." That afternoon, they convened a focus group of community leaders, the high school principal, the head of the regional medical center, the county librarian, and several farmers facing challenges similar to Jackson's. For hours, they discussed the most pressing needs in Clearwater County and how oil revenue might address them sustainably. The result was the Broken Branch Community Prosperity Plan, a detailed proposal for directing oil revenues toward specific local priorities, including a modern medical clinic to serve rural areas currently requiring hour-long drives for basic health care, upgraded school facilities, and teacher retention bonuses to combat the exodus of qualified educators. Expansion of the county library and community center to provide digital access and educational resources. Agricultural diversification grants to help farmers adapt to changing climate conditions. A renewable energy transition fund to ensure long-term sustainability beyond oil dependence. "This is brilliant," Olivia said as they finalized the document. "It transforms an abstract concept into tangible benefits people can understand and support." Rachel was more measured, but equally approving. It directly counters Emerson's narrative about professional management by demonstrating thoughtful planning and specific allocations, and each element addresses needs his company has ignored despite their claims of community support. The plan was publicly released through both traditional media and a newly created website. Within days, it had generated over 2,000 signatures of support from county residents, nearly 20% of the adult population. Local business owners began displaying "Support the Broken Branch Trust" signs in their windows. Carter Emerson III's response was swift and predictable, a competing proposal promising twice the jobs through Clearwater Energy's development approach, though with far less specific community benefits. His press conference emphasized expertise, efficiency, and proven capacity, while subtly questioning Jackson's ability to manage a project of such magnitude. What they hadn't anticipated was Margaret Chen's public resignation from Westland Agricultural Bank, accompanied by a detailed statement about how the Emersons had leveraged her brother's gambling debts to coerce her cooperation in targeting financially vulnerable farmers for acquisition. I can no longer participate in a system designed to strip hard-working families of land they've maintained for generations, her statement concluded. The treatment of Jackson Miller is not an isolated incident, but part of a decades-long pattern of predatory acquisition. The revelation created precisely the kind of public scrutiny they had hoped would constrain Emerson's ability to operate through unofficial channels. Sheriff Roberts, now under community pressure, publicly committed to ensuring fair and legal treatment for all parties in the developing situation. Meanwhile, First Regional Bank had approved bridge financing based on Olivia's certified assessment of the oil deposit, removing the immediate threat of foreclosure. This crucial breathing room allowed them to focus on establishing the legal framework for the community trust without the looming 90-day deadline. The elder Emerson had maintained public silence since their meeting at the covered bridge, though back-channel communications suggested he was considering participation in the trust under specific conditions, primarily related to operational control of extraction activities rather than revenue distribution. It's a strategic repositioning, Rachel explained. If they can't prevent the trust, they'll try to control it from within. We need to ensure the governance structure prevents that kind of gradual takeover. On the 10th day after their initial discovery, as they finalized the trust's legal framework, the first direct counter-move came. A county cease and desist order was delivered to Broken Branch Farm, citing unauthorized modification of a historical water source and potential groundwater contamination. The order demanded immediate halt to all activity related to the well, backed by threat of substantial daily fines. Right out of Abraham's journals, Jackson observed grimly, the parallels to his great-grandfather's experience unmistakable. Using regulations selectively to obstruct access to the resource. Rachel examined the order carefully, signed by Commissioner Phillips, a known Emerson ally. But the scientific basis is extremely thin. We can challenge this effectively, especially with Olivia's environmental expertise. Before they could file their response, a second blow landed. The state banking commissioner announced a routine review of First Regional Bank's recent lending practices, specifically citing collateralization of unproven mineral resources. As an area of concern, the thinly veiled target was obvious to everyone involved. They're attacking on multiple fronts, Marcus said, his academic detachment giving way to genuine concern. Banking regulations, environmental compliance, historical preservation, all areas where they have planted allies over decades. Jackson might have been discouraged by this coordinated assault if not for an unexpected development the following morning. Carter Emerson II requested another private meeting, this time at Broken Branch Farm itself, against the advice of Rachel and her legal team, Jackson agreed. The elder Emerson arrived without entourage or fanfare, his driver remaining with the car as he made his way slowly up the porch steps, cane tapping a deliberate rhythm against the weathered wood. Olivia had reluctantly agreed to give them privacy, though she remained within earshot in case the meeting took an adversarial turn. Your community trust concept has gained more traction than I anticipated, Emerson acknowledged without preamble as they settled in Jackson's living room. The specific allocations were particularly effective, addressing needs my family's companies have overlooked despite our claims of community investment. Jackson remained silent, allowing the old man to continue his assessment. My son is pursuing a multi-pronged regulatory strategy to obstruct your progress, Emerson continued. It has reasonable chances of success given our established influence, though the public attention your approach has generated complicates matters significantly. He tapped his cane thoughtfully against the floor. I've been reviewing the historical Documentation between our families. Your legal team filed impressive research with the trust application, including materials I wasn't aware had survived. Abraham was meticulous, Jackson replied. He documented everything, the regulatory manipulation, the selective enforcement, the attempts at financial coercion. The parallels to current tactics are remarkably consistent. Emerson nodded, neither denying nor defending the comparison. History provides perspective that quarterly profit reports cannot. I find myself considering legacy in a more expansive sense than simply fulfilling my father's directive to secure that oil deposit. He gazed around the modest farmhouse, taking in the evidence of multiple generations, the height markings on the kitchen door frame, the hand-carved furniture passed down through decades, the preserved artifacts of agricultural evolution from horse-drawn plows to early tractors. Your family has maintained this land through multiple crises, adapting without surrendering your core identity, he observed. My family has built an empire but remains fixated on the one thing we couldn't acquire through normal means. There's a lesson in that contrast. Jackson sensed a shift in the old man's perspective, perhaps the clarity that sometimes comes with confronting mortality, or simply the wisdom of age recognizing patterns invisible to younger, more ambitious eyes. What are you proposing? He asked directly. A genuine partnership, Emerson replied. Not the operational manipulation my son envisions, but a legitimate collaboration. Clearwater Energy provides the technical expertise and infrastructure for responsible extraction. The community trust governs revenue allocation and ensures public benefit. Both entities maintain appropriate influence without complete control. He leaned forward slightly. I would require certain conditions. Environmental standards exceeding regulatory minimums, preservation of the historical farm operations, recognition of my family's role in developing regional energy resources. But the core principle of community-directed benefit would remain intact. Jackson studied the old man carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw instead was weariness with conflict, and perhaps a desire to resolve a generational dispute before time ran out. Your son would oppose this approach, Jackson noted. Initially, yes, Emerson acknowledged. But I retain controlling interest in Clearwater Energy until my death. I can mandate this direction despite his objections. A ghost of a smile crossed his lined face. Besides, he's politically ambitious. Once he recognizes the public relations value of the partnership approach, he'll claim credit for the idea and position himself as a champion of innovative community collaboration. The proposal was unexpected, but aligned remarkably well with Jackson's own vision, allowing for professional resource development while ensuring community benefit and preserving the agricultural heritage of Broken Branch Farm. It offered a path to resolution that honored Abraham's stand against exploitation without requiring perpetual conflict. I'd need assurances against future attempts to consolidate control, Jackson stipulated. The trust governance must remain independent and transparent. Reasonable, Emerson agreed. My attorneys can work with Ms. Blackfoot to structure appropriate safeguards. I imagine several independent directors with relevant expertise, but no financial ties to either the Miller or Emerson interests. They continued discussing framework elements for nearly 2 hours, finding surprising common ground despite their family's lengthy history of antagonism. When they eventually shook hands, it wasn't in complete agreement but in commitment to a negotiation process that might finally resolve the century-old dispute. After Emerson departed, Olivia and Rachel joined Jackson in the living room, eager to hear details of the unexpected proposal. It's potentially viable, Rachel acknowledged after Jackson outlined the partnership concept. With proper structural protections and governance transparency, it could achieve our core objectives while leveraging Clearwater's extraction expertise. The elder Emerson seems sincere, Olivia added, though his son's eventual cooperation remains questionable. Jackson nodded, still processing the implications of this potential resolution. Abraham fought to protect what was rightfully his. I've been fighting for something larger. Community benefit from resources that technically belong to me, but should serve many. This partnership approach might achieve that better than continued conflict. Over the following weeks, the legal teams worked to develop the framework for what would be called the Clearwater Community Resource Partnership, a carefully balanced collaboration between the Broken Branch Trust and Clearwater Energy. The regulatory obstacles mysteriously disappeared as quickly as they had emerged, confirming the elder Emerson's continued influence despite his illness. 3 months after Jackson first discovered oil in the ancient well, community leaders gathered at Broken Branch Farm for the official partnership announcement. The event was attended by regional media, state officials, and hundreds of local residents, curious about an arrangement many had believed impossible given the historical power dynamics of Clearwater County. Carter Emerson II and Jackson stood together on the farmhouse porch, the older man noticeably frailer but determined to personally mark this resolution to a conflict that had spanned generations. His son watched from the sidelines, expression carefully neutral, though his eyes revealed continued skepticism about the collaborative approach. This partnership represents not just responsible resource development, but a new model for community prosperity. The elder Emerson told the assembled crowd, "For too long, natural resources have enriched few, while the many bear the costs of extraction. Today, we commit to a different path." When Jackson's turn came to speak, he found himself thinking of Abraham, standing on this same porch more than a century earlier, defending his right to the land and water against powerful interests who believed their wealth entitled them to whatever they desired. "My great-grandfather dug the well that eventually led to this discovery," Jackson said, gesturing toward the stone structure now surrounded by preliminary testing equipment. He didn't know what lay beneath, but he knew the value of standing firm against exploitation. This partnership honors that stand not through continued conflict, but through equitable collaboration. He looked out over the gathering, farmers struggling with the same challenges he had faced, townspeople whose communities would benefit from the trust's investments, young people who might now find reasons to remain in a county that had been steadily losing population for decades. The drought that threatened this farm's existence led to a discovery that can benefit all of us, he continued. But the true value isn't in the oil itself. It's in what we choose to do with this unexpected opportunity. Together, we've chosen community prosperity over private enrichment, collaboration over conflict, sustainable development over short-term gain. As the formal ceremonies concluded, Olivia joined Jackson at the well where their journey had begun. The ancient stones had been carefully preserved despite the modern equipment now surrounding them, a deliberate acknowledgement of how past and present connected at this pivotal site. "From desperate search for water to community oil trust," she remarked, smiling at the incredible evolution of their journey. "Not exactly what you expected when you started digging deeper." "Nothing about the past few months has been expected," Jackson admitted, returning her smile. "Especially meeting a petroleum engineer who quotes poetry and challenges corporate interests." Their relationship had evolved alongside the community trust concept, from professional collaboration to friendship to something deeper neither had anticipated. Olivia had accepted a position as Environmental Compliance Director for the new partnership, ensuring scientific integrity in the extraction process while maintaining her university research connections. "What happens next?" she asked, her question encompassing both the resource development and their personal connection. Jackson looked across the fields of Broken Branch Farm, still recovering from drought but showing promising signs of renewal after recent rains. The land his family had tended for generations would continue as a working farm, while the resources beneath supported broader community development. "We keep building something worthwhile," he answered simply, "here and together." As evening approached, community members lingered on the farm, exploring the property and discussing plans for the trust's initial projects. Children played near the ancient well, unaware of its pivotal role in transforming their community's future. The atmosphere combined celebration of immediate victory with anticipation of long-term prosperity. Jackson knew challenges remained. The younger Emerson's eventual succession would test the partnership's governance structures. Resource management would require vigilant oversight, and balancing agricultural tradition with energy development would demand continuous innovation. But for the first time in generations, the path forward involved collaboration rather than conflict. The well that had run dry had led him to dig deeper, both literally and figuratively, beyond immediate crisis to historical understanding, beyond personal interest to community benefit, beyond entrenched antagonism to unexpected partnership. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family farm had evolved into a model for how rural communities might retain both resource wealth and agricultural heritage. Standing beside Olivia, as sunset painted the farmhouse in warm, golden light, Jackson felt a connection to both past and future, honoring Abraham's legacy while creating something new that would benefit generations yet to come. The dried earth had yielded not just oil, but opportunity, not just wealth, but wisdom about how prosperity might be shared rather than concentrated. The ancient well had indeed run dry, but what Jackson had discovered by digging deeper was far more valuable than water. A chance to transform not just his own circumstances, but the future of an entire community. 3 years after oil first seeped into the ancient well at Broken Branch Farm, the landscape of Clearwater County had transformed, in ways both visible and intangible. What had begun as one farmer's desperate dig during drought had catalyzed changes that rippled through every aspect of community life. The most obvious physical change was the careful development of what locals now called Miller Field, a state-of-the-art extraction operation that balanced technological efficiency with environmental responsibility. Unlike traditional oil fields with their forest of derricks and constant flaring, the development was largely unobtrusive, with horizontal drilling minimizing surface disruption and stringent emissions controls, preventing the telltale smell of petroleum production. Broken Branch Farm itself remained a working agricultural operation, its fields now lush and productive thanks to advanced irrigation systems funded through Jackson's portion of the oil revenues. True to his commitment to agricultural heritage, he had maintained and even expanded farming operations, employing sustainable practices that would preserve the land's fertility for generations to come. Jackson stood on his porch, coffee mug in, and as he did each morning, surveying the harmonious coexistence of agriculture and energy production that many had claimed impossible. Rusty, now moving more slowly in his advanced age, but still faithful, lay at his feet enjoying the early sunshine. "Admiring your handiwork?" Olivia asked, joining him with her own mug of coffee. Their relationship had deepened alongside the community. Transformation, culminating in marriage the previous year, a union that symbolically bridged the scientific and agricultural worlds, just as their partnership had united technical expertise with local knowledge. "Just thinking about how different things looked 3 years ago," Jackson replied, slipping his free arm around her waist. "Drought-stricken fields, foreclosure notice, no future beyond the next 90 days. She leaned into him, both of them, gazing at the subtle evidence of the oil operation visible at the property's edge. A few well-maintained buildings, carefully landscaped to blend with the rural surroundings. From crisis to opportunity, though I'm not sure either of us recognize just how far-reaching the changes would be. The changes extended far beyond Broken Branch Farm. In town, the impact of the Clearwater Community Resource Partnership was visible on nearly every street. The old medical clinic had been replaced by a modern healthcare center serving the entire county, staffed by physicians attracted by competitive salaries and state-of-the-art facilities. The previously declining school district now boasted the highest teacher retention rate in the state, with renovated buildings and expanded educational programs, reversing the steady enrollment decline. Most significant was the shift in community trajectory. For decades, Clearwater County had been losing population as young people left for better opportunities elsewhere. Now, that trend had reversed, with families returning for the improved quality of life, stable employment, and sense of community purpose that the partnership had fostered. The quarterly report came in yesterday, Olivia mentioned, referring to the Trust's transparent financial documentation. The first round of agricultural diversification grants has been fully implemented. 17 farms have successfully transitioned to more drought-resistant crops and methods. Jackson nodded with satisfaction. The grants had been particularly meaningful to him, a way to help other farmers avoid the crisis he had faced during the drought. And the Renewable Transition Fund, growing ahead of schedule. The solar installation at the community center is complete, and the feasibility study for wind development on the eastern ridge looks promising. Olivia's expertise had been instrumental in ensuring the community didn't become dependent on oil. Revenue without planning for a sustainable future beyond fossil fuels. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar black sedan coming up the driveway. Carter Emerson III stepped out, his appearance markedly different from their early confrontations. The aggressive corporate demeanor had softened, replaced by the more measured approach of someone who had learned valuable lessons about community, engagement, and shared prosperity. Following his father's death 2 years earlier, the younger Emerson had initially challenged aspects of the partnership agreement as they had anticipated. But the transparent governance structure, combined with the overwhelmingly positive public response to the community investments, had gradually shifted his perspective. The political ambitions his father had mentioned had indeed materialized. Emerson was now considering a run for state office, and the successful partnership provided a compelling narrative of innovative leadership. "Jackson, Olivia," he greeted them as he climbed the porch steps. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I was reviewing the expansion proposals and wanted to discuss them in person before the board meeting." "Coffee?" Jackson offered, their former antagonism having evolved into a working relationship based on mutual respect, if not friendship. As they settled in the farmhouse dining room, still serving as an occasional meeting space despite the partnership's modern offices in town, Emerson spread out maps showing potential expansion areas for both agricultural and energy development. "The geological surveys indicate we could extend drilling operations to the northwestern section," he explained, indicating an area where Clearwater Energy held adjacent property. "The environmental impact assessment shows minimal disruption. If we use the same horizontal drilling techniques we've employed successfully so far." Olivia studied the technical data critically. Despite the improved relationship, she maintained rigorous scientific oversight of all extraction activities. "The proximity to Eagle Creek concerns me. We'd need additional groundwater monitoring stations and possibly enhanced containment protocols." Emerson nodded, accepting her expertise without the dismissive attitude that had characterized his earlier approach to environmental concerns. "Reasonable additions. We can incorporate those requirements into the operational plan." Their discussion continued for nearly an hour, covering both technical aspects of resource development and broader community impact considerations. The partnership's early success had created a framework for thoughtful expansion that balanced economic benefit with environmental stewardship and community needs. As they concluded their meeting, Emerson paused before leaving. "There's something else I wanted to mention. The State Historical Society has expressed interest in documenting the partnership model for their economic development archives. They see it as a potentially replicable approach for other resource-dependent communities." "That would be valuable documentation," Jackson agreed, "especially the governance structures that ensure community benefit remains the priority regardless of who's in leadership positions." "My father would have appreciated the historical recognition," Emerson observed with unexpected candor. "Despite our differences, I've come to believe he genuinely wanted resolution rather than victory in his final months. This partnership accomplished that in ways neither of our families could have achieved alone." After Emerson departed, Jackson and Olivia took a walk around the property, a daily ritual that kept them connected to both the land and their shared journey. They passed the ancient well, now preserved as a historical site with a commemorative plaque describing its role in transforming the community's future. "Sometimes I wonder what Abraham would think of all this," Jackson mused, touching the weathered stones his great-grandfather had so carefully placed. The partnership with the Emersons, the trust structure, the balance we've struck between private interest and public benefit. "Based on his journals, I think he'd approve," Olivia replied. "He wasn't fighting against resource development itself, but against exploitation and corruption. The partnership ensures fair treatment and equitable distribution of benefits, precisely the principles he stood for." They continued walking toward a new addition to the farm, a research station where agricultural scientists studied drought-resistant crops and sustainable farming methods. The facility, jointly funded by the Trust and the State University, represented the fusion of traditional farming knowledge with cutting-edge science that characterized their approach to land management. The most meaningful legacy isn't just preserving what existed before, Jackson reflected, but building something better for those who come after us. That evening, the Broken Branch Community Center hosted its monthly town hall meeting, another innovation resulting from the partnership, creating regular opportunities for residents to provide input on trust priorities and resource allocation. The former pattern of decisions made behind closed doors by a few powerful interests had been replaced by transparent governance and active community participation. Jackson and Olivia sat among their neighbors rather than at the front of the room, listening as residents discussed everything from playground equipment for the expanded park system to scholarship programs for local students pursuing higher education. The conversation was lively but respectful, with diverse perspectives contributing to a shared vision of community development. Margaret Chen, now serving as the Trust's financial director after rebuilding her career post-Westland Bank, presented the quarterly investment report with characteristic thoroughness. Her brother Marcus, having overcome his gambling addiction with support from the Community Mental Health Services funded by the Trust, provided updates on the geological research program he supervised at the local community college. The partnership model continues to attract national attention, Margaret noted toward the end of her presentation. 3 delegations from resource-dependent communities in other states have scheduled visits to study our governance structure and benefit allocation approach. The interest from other communities was particularly meaningful to Jackson. What had begun as a personal struggle to save his family farm had evolved into a potential template for how rural America might address the often contentious relationship between resource extraction, environmental protection, and community prosperity. As the meeting concluded, several teenagers presented their proposal for a youth entrepreneurship program to be funded through the Trust's education initiative. Their confidence and vision represented perhaps the most significant transformation, a generation growing up with both expanded opportunities and a model of collaborative problem-solving rather than zero-sum competition. Walking home under a star-filled sky, Jackson and Olivia passed the site where construction would soon begin on workforce housing. Quality, affordable homes that would allow those employed by both the agricultural operations and energy development to live in the community they served. The project exemplified their holistic approach to sustainable development, addressing interconnected needs rather than isolated problems. From a dry well to all of this, Olivia said, gesturing toward the thriving community around them. It still amazes me how one crisis and discovery could catalyze such comprehensive change. It wasn't just the discovery, Jackson pointed out. It was the choice about what to do with it. We could have sold to the Emersons, or I could have developed it privately and maximized personal profit. The community approach wasn't the easiest path, but it was the right one. Their conversation continued as they approached Broken Branch Farm, the renovated farmhouse now illuminated by energy-efficient lighting, powered partially by the solar panels they had installed on the south-facing barn roof. The property remained the physical and symbolic heart of the partnership, the place where crisis had transformed into opportunity, where conflict had evolved into collaboration. The following morning brought news that the community health center had recruited 2 additional specialists, addressing service gaps that had previously required residents to travel hours for certain medical care. The Agricultural Diversification Program had approved another round of transition grants, helping more farmers adopt climate-resilient practices. The community college reported record enrollment in its expanded technical training programs. Each development represented another thread in the fabric of transformation that had been woven since that day Jackson's pickaxe had struck oil instead of water. The integrated approach to community development, addressing healthcare, education, housing, environmental protection, and economic opportunity simultaneously, had created a resilience that single-focus initiatives could never achieve. Perhaps most significant was the change in community psychology. The fatalism that had characterized Clearwater County during its decades of decline had been replaced by pragmatic optimism, a belief that challenges could be overcome through collaborative problem-solving and equitable resource sharing. The drought that had threatened everything Jackson valued had ultimately revealed something more precious than oil, a pathway to community renewal based on shared benefit rather than concentrated wealth, on partnership rather than exploitation, on sustainable development rather than short-term extraction. As he watched the morning sun illuminate his fields, Jackson reflected on the journey from desperate farmer to community trust architect. The oil beneath Broken Branch Farm had provided financial salvation, but the true treasure had been the opportunity to transform not just his own circumstances, but the trajectory of an entire community. The ancient well had indeed run dry, forcing him to dig deeper both literally and metaphorically, beyond immediate crisis to historical understanding, beyond personal interest to community benefit, beyond entrenched conflict to unexpected collaboration. What he had discovered in that desperate dig was not just a resource beneath the surface, but a capacity for transformation that ran far deeper than any oil deposit ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 10 years after Jackson Miller's desperate dig into the ancient well, the transformation of Clearwater County had become a case study in sustainable community development. Educational institutions, policy think tanks, and resource-dependent communities across the country sent representatives to study what locals now simply called the broken branch model. On a crisp autumn morning, Jackson stood at the edge of his alfalfa field, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma carefully examine soil samples as part of her science project. Beside her, Olivia provided gentle guidance while their 4-year-old son Thomas attempted to mimic his sister's methodical approach with considerably less precision, but equal enthusiasm. "The organic content is much higher than it was in Grandpa's time," Emma declared, with the certainty of a child raised among farmers and scientists. "That means the regenerative practices are working." Jackson smiled at his daughter's precocious understanding of agricultural science, a natural fusion of his practical farming knowledge and Olivia's scientific expertise. Emma had inherited Abraham's meticulous nature and passion for documentation, keeping careful journals of her observations around the farm that reminded Jackson powerfully of his great-grandfather's records. "The soil restoration program has exceeded our projections," Olivia confirmed, ruffling their son's hair as he enthusiastically dug another small hole. "The 5-year data shows significant improvement in both water retention and carbon sequestration." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small convoy of vehicles coming up the farm's main drive, the scheduled tour of international agricultural ministers interested in the integrated resource management model developed at Broken Branch Farm. As chair of the Clearwater Community Resource Partnership, Jackson had become an unexpected ambassador for their approach, regularly hosting delegations seeking to understand how the principles might be adapted to their own regions. "Right on time," Jackson noted, checking his watch. "Emma, would you like to show the ministers your soil comparison project? They'd be particularly interested in your historical data tracking." Emma's face lit up at the prospect of presenting her research to important visitors, while Thomas immediately began to explain his own project, investigating the impact of earthworms with more enthusiasm than scientific rigor. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Jackson reflected on how completely his life had been transformed from that moment of crisis 10 years earlier. The desperate farmer facing foreclosure had evolved into a recognized innovator in community-based resource management, speaking at conferences and advising policymakers on integrated development approaches that balanced extraction, agriculture, and community benefit. "Jackson!" called a familiar voice as they approached the gathering of officials. Carter Emerson III, now serving his second term as state governor, extended his hand in greeting. Their former antagonism had evolved into a productive professional relationship that many found surprising given their family's historical conflict. "Governor," Jackson replied with a nod and genuine smile, "I didn't realize you'd be joining the tour today." "Couldn't miss the opportunity to showcase our state's most innovative public-private partnership," Emerson said, "especially with the federal sustainability grant announcement coming next week." The transformation in Emerson had been perhaps the most unexpected development of the past decade. Following his father's death, he had initially continued challenging aspects of the partnership agreement. But as the community benefits became increasingly evident and his own political aspirations evolved, he had gradually become one of the model's most vocal advocates, incorporating its principles into state-level resource management policies and promoting it nationally as an alternative to traditional extraction approaches. The visiting delegation included agricultural ministers from 3 drought-affected countries, each facing their own challenges balancing resource development with agricultural preservation and community benefit. As Jackson led them around the property, he emphasized the integrated nature of their approach. "The key insight wasn't technological, but philosophical," he explained as they toured the research center that had been established on the farm's northern section. treating resource extraction, agricultural sustainability, and community development as interconnected rather than competing priorities created possibilities that weren't visible when each was considered in isolation. The research center represented that integration in physical form, combining petroleum engineering innovation, agricultural science, and environmental monitoring under one roof. Researchers from diverse disciplines collaborated on challenges ranging from water conservation to soil carbon sequestration to renewable energy transition. The original oil discovery could have been managed conventionally, Jackson continued, as they observed scientists testing new irrigation technologies in the experimental fields. Extract maximum value quickly, create temporary prosperity, and leave the community vulnerable when the resource inevitably depletes. Instead, we chose to leverage it as catalytic capital for long-term development. One of the ministers raised the question Jackson had heard countless times over the years, but surely this required exceptional circumstances. The specific mineral rights structure, your family's historical connection to the land, the particular community dynamics. How can others replicate this success without those unique conditions? Olivia stepped in to address this common misconception. The specific legal and historical elements were important to our process, but the fundamental principles are widely applicable. Transparency in governance, equitable benefit sharing, integrated resource management, and long-term sustainability planning can be adapted to various contexts. The essential shift, Jackson added, is viewing natural resources not as something to be extracted for maximum short-term gain, but as community assets to be managed for multi-generational benefit. As the tour continued to the community center in town, Emma proudly presented her soil quality research to the impressed officials, explaining how historical data from her great-great-grandfather's journals provided baseline measurements for evaluating modern regenerative practices. The soil is actually better now than it was 100 years ago, she concluded with evident satisfaction, even though we're producing more food and using less water. Her presentation perfectly illustrated the multi-generational thinking that had become central to the broken branch approach, honoring historical knowledge while embracing innovation, preserving agricultural tradition while adapting to changing conditions. The afternoon concluded with a community dinner where visitors could interact informally with residents and hear first-hand accounts of how the partnership had affected daily life in Clearwater County. The gathering was held in what had once been an abandoned warehouse, but was now a thriving community marketplace where local farmers, artisans, and small businesses showcased their products. Jackson observed the vibrant scene with quiet satisfaction. The county that had been steadily declining when he inherited Broken Branch Farm was now experiencing population growth, economic diversification, and cultural revitalization. Young people who would once have left for urban opportunities were finding reasons to stay or return, bringing new energy and ideas to the community. As the official delegation departed, Jackson and Olivia walked with their children back toward the farm, taking the longer route that passed the ancient well, now preserved as a historical monument with educational displays, explaining its pivotal role in the community's transformation. "Dad, can you tell us the well story again?" Thomas asked, his fascination with the family legend undiminished, despite having heard it countless times. "Well," Jackson began, lifting his son onto his shoulders as they approached the stone structure. "It started during the worst drought anyone could remember. Our farm was dying, we had no money left, and the bank was going to take everything away." He recounted the story for his children once more, the desperate dig for water, the discovery of oil instead, the conflict with the Emersons, and the ultimately transformative decision to create the community trust rather than pursue personal enrichment. "But why didn't you just keep all the money?" Thomas asked with the directness of a child. Ms. Larson said in school that the oil could have made you as rich as a king. Jackson exchanged a glance with Olivia, both understanding the importance of helping their children grasp the values that had shaped their decisions. I could have, Jackson acknowledged, but that would have been wealth just for our family. By choosing the community approach, we created something much more valuable than money. Like what? Emma asked, though she already knew the answer from previous tellings. Like the new medical center where Thomas was born, Jackson replied. Like your school, with all its science equipment. Like the programs that help other farmers try new methods without risking everything if they don't work right away. And like how people don't have to move away to find good jobs anymore, Emma added, demonstrating her understanding of the broader impacts. They reached the well, its weathered stones now protected by a simple structure that preserved it while allowing visitors to view the historical site. A plaque detailed its significance, and interactive displays explained both the geological features that created the oil deposit and the community development model that had emerged from its discovery. Jackson lifted Thomas from his shoulders and set him down beside the well, where both children peered into its depths with perpetual fascination. What would have happened if you had found water instead of oil? Emma asked, posing a question she hadn't raised before. Jackson considered this thoughtfully. We might have saved the farm, at least temporarily, but we wouldn't have had the opportunity to create something that helps so many people. Sometimes, Olivia added, what seems like the worst possible outcome, a well running dry during drought, can lead to discoveries and possibilities we couldn't have imagined. As they continued their walk home in the fading light, Jackson reflected on how completely his understanding of value had transformed over the past decade. The desperate farmer who had sought only to save his family's land had discovered something far more meaningful than the oil itself, a vision of community prosperity that honored the past while creating new possibilities for the future. Abraham Miller had fought to protect his land and rights against powerful interests who used their wealth and influence to take what wasn't rightfully theirs. Jackson had continued that fight, but expanded its purpose, not just defending individual rights, but advancing collective welfare, not just preserving agricultural heritage, but evolving it to meet new challenges. The ancient well had indeed run dry, forcing him to dig deeper both literally and figuratively. What he had discovered in that moment of crisis was not just a valuable resource, but a transformative opportunity, a chance to reimagine the relationship between natural resources, individual rights, and community benefit. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Jackson and Olivia sat on the farmhouse porch, watching fireflies rise from the fields, a simple pleasure that connected them to generations of farmers who had occupied this same space before. Them. Sometimes I still can't believe how it all unfolded, Jackson said quietly, from nearly losing everything to creating something neither the Millers nor the Emersons could have envisioned. The crisis created possibility, Olivia replied, her scientific mind always seeking patterns and principles. By threatening everything you valued, it forced you to dig deeper, both into the earth and into yourself. Her observation captured the essence of their journey. The drought that had nearly destroyed Broken Branch Farm had ultimately revealed something more valuable than either water or oil. The capacity for transformation that occurs when crisis becomes opportunity, when conflict evolves into collaboration, when individual interests expand to encompass community welfare. As darkness settled over the farm his family had tended for generations, Jackson felt profound gratitude for the apparent disaster that had forced him to dig deeper into an ancient well, a desperate act that had uncovered not just material resources, but the foundation for a more equitable and sustainable future. Shoo. Well had run dry, but what flowed from that seeming calamity was far more precious than water. a legacy of innovation, collaboration, and shared prosperity that would nourish the community for generations to come. This remarkable story of transformation reminds us that often our greatest challenges can lead to our most meaningful opportunities if we have the courage to dig deeper, question established patterns, and imagine possibilities beyond our immediate circumstances. If you've enjoyed this journey from crisis to community transformation, please subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary true stories that reveal the unexpected ways ordinary people create extraordinary change. And don't forget to check out our other videos showing how apparent disasters have led to remarkable innovations and opportunities. Until next time, remember that sometimes what seems like the end of one path is actually the beginning of a much greater journey, one that might impact not just your own life, but the lives of an entire community for generations to come.